Going. Welcome.
Howdy.
How are you guys doing? Yes, we are live at VGM Together. This is really great. This is now my second time doing a VGM Together event. We're really happy to be kicking off the staff spotlight today. We are Pixelated Audio. My name is Dreyband, and joining me is my co-host and the podcast's creator, Bryan Mosley.
Howdy. Welcome to VGM Together 2022.
We've already got some hellos in the chat. Hey, folks. So some of you may already know me. As I mentioned, I was a volunteer last year at VGM Together. I was on the music team. I worked helping for music discovery, artist discovery, and booking. And I also helped put together the band performance schedule. So if kind of like the show flow, I had big part in that, which was a lot of fun. Of course, I was not the only member on the team. I could not have done it without all the great support from Josh and Laura, the music leads, the event coordinators, Nuge and Doug, and so many other wonderful people that helped put on the event. And we're happy to be back. The event is about talking about stuff that goes on behind the scenes. So I'll let Bryan tell a little bit about himself and the podcast before we get to our topic.
Yeah. So if you haven't heard of Pixelated Audio, we're a long running video game music podcast started in 2014. And we cover a really broad spectrum on mostly preservation of VGM. A big part of our shows is playing music from games, but and we're going to be doing that today. But we we're only going to be playing some clips today for the live stream, but you can hear this after the fact in their full, 5-minute glory or
In their
however
full
long the song.
glory, yes.
Yeah,
The show's gonna be a little longer when it gets released.
right. In addition to the music, we talk about the game on our normal show. We talk about the game, the context of the game's development, about the composers, as well as technical hardware, and some implementation aspects as well. We try to be as thorough as possible, and we also try to do that without coming off as boring because some of the details can get really deep in the weeds, but some of these are really interesting and help keep preservation active. So it's
It's a tightrope
challenging.
walk,
Yeah,
for sure.
right.
But yeah, a crucial part of our show is we often feature guests from the wider audio community, the game audio community. Sometimes it's just fans, but a lot of times we have musicians and composers. We've had some really amazing guests over the years. We spoke with Saori Kobayashi of the Panzer Dragoon series. We've had equally amazing, but maybe lesser known composers like Dane Saint. That was one of my favorite shows.
That was a really
Oh, it
good
was an
show. Go back
amazing
and listen to that.
show. Yeah, we had Dan Hess on not too long ago of Pilot Wing 64, which led us directly to speaking with Charlie Rosen of the 8-Bit Big Band, and we were very much starstruck. We were able to record that show just before, fingers crossed. We had no idea that the Grammy win was happening, so it was like we were, it was in suspense. It was just an amazing moment in video game music history, and we're so proud of everything that they've accomplished.
Yeah, we've covered games and music across just this huge spectrum of stuff from popular to obscure, usually on the obscure side because it's, less
That's
in
what
the
we do.
spotlight, for just about every single platform you can think of. We gave a talk about the evolution of game audio at the Library of Congress in 2000. Was that 2018 or 19? I think it was a
2019, yeah.
Was it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Before all the world went to shambles. But we've also done, from Library of Congress, we've also done a show on a Colgate Toothman mascot in your Comic Sans there. Have fun doing it.
Yes, he is our unofficial mascot for the show. That's Harold Hardtooth.
Yes, a game about brushing, getting all that evil plaque
Plaque.
off of your
Yeah,
off your teeth. At the end of the day, though, we're just two guys that love game audio, and as long as it's good music and a good story to tell, we like to be kind of behind it as much as we can.
exactly. So what are we talking about today, Bryan?
Yeah. So today, we're talking. It's kind of an ambitious, maybe too ambitious topic for the 40 minutes or so that we're given here, but we want to touch on this because it's really important, and we feel like this is a good place to do it. Um, so. Uh, Why are we talking about game audio logging and archiving? Well, simply put, it's the process of capturing game audio for the purpose of archiving exactly how it sounds to the technology that it was used on, or the system, or the audio formats,
Or as close as possible.
as
Yeah.
close as possible. And why we're talking about it, a couple of reasons actually. The first is that logging contributes to the tremendous uh, efforts that are being done in the VGM community. But it's something that often gets taken for granted or overlooked just because, it's a lot of work under the hood, I guess.
Yeah,
A
yeah.
big part of why you can search for just about anything on YouTube or on whatever place you're listening to your audio, Spotify or whatever, is because of this huge amount of effort that people have put into for the logging community. And second, even though Gene and I rely heavily on log music for our shows, sometimes even we kind of gloss over how much hard work actually goes in behind the scenes to bring that music to the masses. And this is why it kind of fits perfectly in with the theme of this event is, a staff spotlight, more of like a, you know, unsung heroes kind of spotlight.
Yeah, when we heard about the event, they're saying, "Why don't you focus on the staff members behind the scenes?" And we're like, "Why don't we hand the baton over to people who are even more in the shadows than we are?"
Yeah, it's
So,
it's really
yeah.
kind of digging deep, and again, it's an ambitious topic, and we're not going to touch on everything here, but we want to at least look at the surface layer and talk about, and maybe give you a little bit more appreciation, more than you already have, for some of the music that we can listen to today, a lot easier.
Yeah, and if we get any small details wrong or we gloss over things, we apologize. We gotta cover a lot of ground. So, moving on, Brian.
We started off with, let's just say we started off with like a million slides, and we had to narrow it down to what would fit in this budget of time. So we're going to try to be very surface on it. Anyways, let's take a break from talking about us and the show and stuff, and talk about an example of video game logging. On the left here, we have an example that we're going to play. Do you want to play that, and we can talk about the stuff,
Of
or
course.
you want to talk about it first?
No, no, I wanna play it first just so people have the tune in their ear.
All right, take a listen.
Ah, so good.
Yeah, that
So
was
good. I
awesome.
love that tune.
You know why we picked this actually, or I decided to put this in there only because this is the first episode we featured this, the first episode that Gene and I did together actually, because it was such a fun, bouncy soundtrack, amazing composer, and we learned so much about the kind of production about this game.
Oh, yeah.
That
Yeah, it inspired us to even do a deep dive on the composer on a later episode, which is, to date, one of my favorite episodes that we ever put together.
Yep.
So,
Yep.
yeah.
So that bouncy little track, this came out for the MSX, and it was, it's standard MSX music, but it has some really catchy stuff to it. And a lot of this music would never have been, brought to the, a Western audience because it was released only in Japan. It's called Yude-kun or Mr. Ghost. And it wouldn't have made its way into our ears easily without the work that we're talking about here. People actually putting in the time to log this game, or at least find something that is important to share with others. And
So what's going on in that screenshot?
yeah,
That's
yeah. So we listen to this music. It's got this fun, bouncy feel. And in the screenshot next to it is an example of what the instructions are to the sound chip itself. Now, this is VGM to text. It's part of a tool set for VGM logging. And I ran the VGM file through it, and you can kind of see this output. And it gives you things like the frequencies to play, when certain channels need to stop, when they need to rise in volume, envelope changes, and stuff like that, and all the samples. So it's kind of a visual representation of what the sound chip would have to kind of interpret and produce to make the sounds. Um,
Should we move on? I
yeah,
wanna
I think
dive
we
in.
can.
Yeah, yeah. It's a dense topic, I'll be honest. So, logging as an activity, sometimes it's actually pretty easy. It's just almost as simple as just, like, opening up the game files and saying, "Oh, hey, here's the music." But, you have to have at least some basic computer skills. Sometimes it's quite a lot for some of the really sophisticated ones. Generally, if you've got some programming, some light hacking skills, you can probably get pretty far. Unfortunately, with game audio logging, there's really no good way to tell how difficult a project is going to be. You can be looking at two games, same company, same system. One of
Same
them is
composer,
straightforward. Same
same,
composer, yeah.
yeah,
And the
everything.
other one is like, it's going to take me like 3 weeks to figure out how they put this together, how they like crammed it in there. So, if you grew up playing on like the Genesis or the Super Nintendo, you know that a lot of games came with a sound test, or sometimes CD games had music in like WAV files or Middies. Unfortunately, that was more of just a period of time. Nowadays, it's rarely that simple, but it sometimes you're lucky, most of the time you're not. And there's a lot of things that can complicate the process. If the data is compressed, if it's disorganized, sometimes it's stored in weird places. Half of it's in one place, another half is somewhere else. It can be in a custom data format that's only unique to that game. And if you're wondering why somebody would go through the trouble of making a custom format, well, there's a lot of reasons. The main one is probably implementation needs. And the other one is,
Optimization and
oh,
yeah,
yeah. But the other thing is a lot of musicians are also that work in the games industry are also themselves software developers and programmers. And like, I can't get the game to do what I want it to do. So I got to write my own tools. It's just, we don't have the flexibility. They either do it themselves or work with a developer. And now it makes our job harder. But,
right. We've talked to a number of composers on the show that they've had to write their own, sound drivers, which is the software that communicates to the hardware. And, a lot of it's custom just so they can get their needs across. I remember a good example was Matt Furness. He talked about doing some of the music when we had him on a few years ago. And he had to really work hand in hand with his engineering team doing the sound drivers to make sure the audio would come across the way that he wanted it. And that added a whole other layer of complications to things. So,
yeah.
yeah, it could be a challenge.
So, just to keep things very simple, there's generally kind of three ways that you get the music out of the game. These are like categories or families. There's a lot of variability here. The first one is essentially you have the music data, whatever that means, and you play it back on some kind of hardware and you record it literally as it's coming out of your machine as a live audio recording. So some of these really hard to emulate chips just don't sound as good. So the easiest way is to boot it up on your old trusty whatever machine, figure out a way to essentially hit record, and then out comes an audio recording. The second way is kind of similar, except instead of putting it to a recording, you're pushing it out to some kind of data file. So that those kinds of instruction files, just a little bit more simple and easy to understand. Common ones are like NSF for the NES, SID for Commodore 64.
And think of it kind of like a
Yeah.
proxy in between the sound chip, kind of extracting that data that is being communicated to the sound hardware.
Yeah, I kind of liken it to you're telling the machine to write sheet music, essentially, which can be later played back in another player or in some other format. And the third way is sometimes we talked about this, you do just have the audio as formats that are already easily readable waves, MIDIs, MP3s. Although sometimes the game needs to be compressed in a certain way. So you kind of have to untwist it and be like, oh, so it's actually stored in a normal way, but you kind of have to go around a couple of corners to find it. So it's not always these really esoteric file formats, but you know, game development is complex. What else can we say? So let's move it along. We talked a little bit about logging, the idea of actually doing the capture, but the thing is, logging is really just one part of the work. We mentioned explicitly at the start of the show, it's logging and archiving. I'm going to let Bryan talk about this because he has a lot more experience. But man, there's so much that goes into this.
Again, remember these are the cliff notes here because there's really a lot to it, and every situation is so different. But really, just to give you an idea of how much effort really has to go into just a simple pack, like we're talking about Udacum, that Mr. Ghost that we played earlier. Um, think of it in a kind of multi-tiered steps here. Getting access to the music, that's a hard part right there, right? Knowing where that data lives. We know we have the game. Where do we I wish I had the graphic of, Zoolander when they're like banging. The
Yeah, how do
files are
you
in the computer.
yeah, I know. I was thinking about that analogy as we were writing the draft for this.
It's really hard to know where that data actually lives, and there's no way to know ahead of time without, being on that engineering team.
Yeah.
And then getting yourself set up for accurate logging, right? Knowing what tools you have to get sample accurate data or as close as possible.
Here, let me
Logging,
let me let me add a really
yeah,
quick one to that one. When games were a lot smaller, sometimes they would have half the sample rate. Most digital audio workstations will play at 44.1. So you'll throw the song in there and it's like, it's twice as fast as it should be. So you actually have to manually set it to play at half the speed because the conditions are not quite what it's expecting. So, even something as simple as that.
Exactly, exactly. And then logging the music, including setting loop points and finding like exactly how the instructions, how it would be played if you were playing it in the game, but obviously outside of the context. Next item on here is getting accurate composer and production information. And this can be super time consuming and sometimes impossible. We have gone so far in certain episodes to just track down anybody who was involved in the audio so that we could show that appreciation. And sometimes we've spent hours and hours, more than any other research that we have
Oh
in the
yeah.
episode, is trying to track down just a name. And that and to be accurate about it is quite a challenge.
Yeah, that Manabu Saito episode took me almost a month of research to make sure I had the closest I could to accurate information. Blogs, production credits, wikis, conflicting wikis. There was a lot
Yeah.
of just like figuring out what is
It's
real here,
it's one thing to just, go on Wikipedia and read a few things, but it's another thing to actually cross-reference, find different sources, people close to the composers, or maybe somebody who worked in the field. That's a whole other that's a whole other topic in itself.
Yeah, yeah.
The next part in here is really cleaning up that audio or relogging if there's any issues. The logging process is also about um, being able, if needed, to correct mistakes that were introduced during the development process, not just the composition side of it or the production side of it from the music standpoint, but maybe something in the driver was causing like a clicking noise that you wouldn't hear. I was trying to come up with a good example, but we ended up getting sidetracked, Gina. So we never got a good
Well,
example here.
well,
But
we
there's
had an
so many.
episode with that racing game. I'm trying to remember what it was. The PlayStation 1 racing game where there was just like a click every like
Right, right, right. Hover
measure or
Racer.
something. Hover racer.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that was from Electric Boogaloo,
Right,
and
and he went through the trouble of actually editing those out, and so the
yeah,
sound is much better than if you had heard it actually on hardware.
right.
So
So, and then that brings us to another topic, like a sub bullet of that is saying like, well, what is accurate, right? Like cleaning up logging. A lot of packs, you'll see multiple versions of the same track. And that's usually saying like, hey, here's how it sounded after it was
oh, yeah.
introduced into the system, how it would sound out to a user. That is the preservation of that file. But maybe the
Yeah.
preservation of that file is also how the composer intended it, which not is not
Yeah.
what you would hear. So
We'll
there's
definitely
multiple
get
facets
there,
of
yeah.
that.
We
Yeah.
gotta we gotta hustle through. There's a lot to talk about here, but yeah, just,
naming
yeah.
naming and tagging all of the files, that's one. Compressing, optimizing the music data to save space, creating editor notes for the collections, where your research comes from, XYZ, and distributing the music responsibly. Now, this is a very weirdly gray box area, and we all know it's a gray box area, but the key word here is responsibly, right? The goal of all of this isn't to hurt musicians at
No,
all or take
not at
sales
all.
away. Far from it. It's really the opposite. It's about bringing attention to this wonderful music that may or may not have been forgotten otherwise. Of course, there's a lot of people that do share brand new music as it comes out. That doesn't represent the majority of this community. Really, the people that are logging this are simply that much more interested in the historical side of it and also enjoying the music outside of context.
Yeah, exactly. We're going back, we're separating fact from fiction, and we're really trying to understand this as fully as we can. So with that said, I want to take a quick little music break. We've kind of dumped a lot of information at you. I have this example. It's from a game that some of you know now called Earthbound Beginnings. It was the unreleased English version of what we now know as Earthbound or Mother. It's a series that's been around for many, many years. This is a really interesting one because the English version actually had a unique second ending, and I'm going to play it right now. I'm going to play a little clip from it that was not in the Japanese version. So here we go. It's a cool track. It goes
Sounds
on
like
for another
something.
minute. Yeah.
It sounds like something that would have been like TNC Surf Designs or something like that.
Yeah, yeah. So the story with this track is kind of interesting. Well, to me, it's interesting. So I was briefly involved in an Earthbound community where we were doing some transcriptions of music from the first game to make it sound like it was in the Super NES. So we are using the sound fonts. And then I was watching the credits of this game, and I'm like, "That's funny. I don't remember seeing this in any of the audio files I was looking at before." And it turns out that this was added explicitly for the American version. Mind you, the American version that for 30 years was not released. It was supposed to go out in 1990, 1991. So here I am sitting in like 2018 working in the community. And it's like, does anybody know what's going on here? So I reached out, and a person by the name of Mr. Norbert 1994 was like, huh, you're right. Let's get that music out of there. So he went through the trouble of logging it. Took him a few days to figure it out because it was stored kind of strangely. And hey, I have a very small part in helping get this music out there. We honestly had no idea that the game was ever going to get released. We figured it was just going to stay as one of these Japanese only games that only, people involved in emulation would ever be able to hear about. So it was really cool that it did come out, but we know that does not happen very often. So that said, I also want to give a special shout to Mr. Norbert 1994, who is currently one of the most prominent people in the NES logging community, and they're the ones maintaining the most up-to-date NES archive out there. So if you have a game that you love and you couldn't find it, chances are it's there, but you may not have been able to find it a few years ago because this is still somewhat of an active community. Anyway, I'm going to move on from here. So we've talked a little bit about what the data, how it's stored, but I want to get a little bit more concrete on, or we've talked about how the music is logged, but I want to actually get more concrete on how the music is stored in the games. Again, these are broad categories or broad families. We've talked a lot about this idea of music instruction data. So it's just like little, small data files telling the system what to play when. I think folks know what recordings are. We'll talk a little bit about that. And of course, interactive and dynamic music. So we're going to break these down a little bit more just so, and as an example to play some music. So coming up first, we have what I call instruction data plus dedicated sound hardware. So if you had a console and it had sound hardware on board that wasn't just like what we have in modern computers today, maybe it was an FM chip, maybe it was the NES sound chip, maybe it was a sample player, whatever the case, you kind of knew what hardware you had to work with. So the files were, well, the data, not even the files, were designed so that, okay, I know what to expect. This is how it plays. So again, most consoles in the 80s and 90s, a lot of PC sound cards, Japanese computer systems, and similarly, most arcade games in the 80s and 90s would have these dedicated sound cards on board. So going back to that first example, Yurei-kun from the MSX very much fits into this category. And having these small file sizes is really important when space is limited. So we talk about this kind of music a lot on our show, but I want to jump into our next example, which is something I love. This is from the game The Smurfs on the Game Boy. This track is The Mountains. I'm going to play it real quick. Some of you may know this. If you don't, hopefully you'll be surprised. It sounds great. It goes on from there. It's a wonderful track. So if you're a big fan of VGM, if you've gone really deep in the weeds, you may already know this track. But for a lot of folks, you may never have heard the name Alberto Jose Gonzalez. He was pretty unknown for a very long time, at least in the US, because most of his work was on European licensed games like Smurfs, Asterix and Obelix, Tintin, on Nintendo consoles and handhelds. And nobody in Europe really cared about those things in the 90s. So honestly, almost nobody was listening to this music except for 10-year-olds that got a Smurfs game. So here we have this guy making really amazing video game music that's as good as some of the stuff that we know because it was in a much, much more popular game. And now because of logging, we're able to hear it much more easily. And in the community, Alberto Gonzalez has become something of a household name. I mean, not really, but much more prominent than he used to be.
Yeah, and he shares stuff on, Twitter, Facebook, and all sorts of old stuff that he has worked on, and he's like the nicest, sweetest guy ever, and his music is just undistinguishable from a lot of other stuff. You can always listen and hear an Alberto Jose Gonzalez track and know exactly who's it comes from. So
All right, Brian, you want to take this section?
sure thing. What do we got next? Yeah, self-contained music is the kind of next quote unquote bullet point that we want to talk about here. And if you've been in tracking communities, demo scenes, stuff like that, you'd be familiar with it. A lot of these are self-contained files that include all of the samples and the instructions to play back. So these are usually mod files or different tracker style music or tracker files. They're very portable. You can transfer them from one machine to another. As long as you have a playback engine, you're totally fine. Very popular for hobbyists, musicians outside of games. Really big on, in the 80s and 90s on the Amiga, C64 and PC, which is why they just became basically trackers were the number one use in the West, especially for creating music for computers, early computer systems.
Believe it or not, this was like the easiest way to talk to the computer before we had really sophisticated audio workstations or any of these tools. So they were very popular for quite a while.
Right. Now, you're not streaming audio like an MP3 or Wave or something like that. These, maybe like an MP3 would take up, like 5 megs or something like that. But since all the samples are small and reused here, the instructions are relatively just text. They take up significantly less data. Still take up more than maybe say, the instructions to, an NES or a Game Boy, but still a lot less data because still at the time there was memory limitations. And so this played a big role in how developers and composers, sound engineers had to work with the software they used. The Super NES, for example, uses samples and song data. It's very similar to this, but it wasn't until logging that a lot of that music became available outside of the commercial games.
Yeah.
It's a lot easier to access something like a mod file, again, this tracker music, with home computers in mind. So
yeah, we're going to move on to our next track, but I do want to say, unlike that first example, this is actually pretty close to how the file actually looks. People are writing in, C7, play, this, whatever, for how many notes. It's not the easiest thing to understand, but it is pretty space efficient, when you have a rectangular, a square monitor and not a good resolution. So I'm going to move on to our next track, which is an example of this. Tell us a little bit about this one, Brian.
Okay, yeah. So, Isotoxin. This is from Unreal on PC, and this was composed by Andrew Sega. And it uses a custom format UMX. It can be read. That last screenshot that we just saw was actually music from this game. Why don't we go ahead and play that, and then we'll talk about it a little bit.
Sounds good. Nice.
Awesome. Yeah. We were just talking about this the other day, Gene and I.
Yeah.
There's a certain style of people that like this old kind of 90s techno trance kind of stuff that was
If you grew
really
up
big
with
in
it, yeah.
games. Yeah, if you grew up with it. Yeah. So this was Epic developed they Epic Mega Games. They developed their own custom format UMX, which they were used in several different games. The entire soundtrack is less than 100 megabytes, and it's over an hour of music. So that kind of gives you an idea of, they use a lot of large samples and stuff like that, which adds to the file size. But at the end of the day, 100 megabytes, an hour of music, that's pretty good for back then, before compression was really kind of tamed.
Exactly.
The Unreal Engine to this day remains a very popular game engine in development. So oh yeah, don't jump the gun.
Sorry about that. Yeah. Just trying to keep an eye on the time. Yeah.
No, we're good. but yeah, real quick, last note on mod music is because of how user friendly the format is. Software developers often wrote their own tools and custom formats. So if you look at the Amiga lifespan, just in the Amiga, there's over 150 different like mod style formats for a system that was almost exclusively developed around sample playback. So
Yeah.
yeah, and
So that's a logger's challenge. It's kind of a nightmare actually to to translate all of those different
right.
formats.
Right. Luckily, there's some good tools out there that have been worked on for decades now, to
Exactly.
to get this back. But you know, it is a challenge.
I'm moving us along to a topic that I love talking about, but I sometimes don't like listening to. Um, I'm referring to MIDIs here as generic music data because unlike the previous examples, they are truly generic. They don't necessarily know what kind of audio hardware you're going to get. Sometimes it's specific, sometimes it's not. Because for those of you that know, MIDI was a standard that was formalized in the 80s just so you could communicate between, musical instrument digital interface. That's what that stands for. So synthesizers and computers and things could talk to each other. It's truly just generic instruction information. In fact, a lot of it looks very similar to what you saw in those screenshots with lots of hexadecimal values. In the 90s, you started to get libraries like General MIDI, and General MIDI was kind of a best effort to have something that everybody could play, even if you didn't have really good hardware. It gets a lot of a bad rap, but it's even General MIDI can sound pretty good. But the big advantage is, of course, portability and the very small file sizes. So yes, Canyon.mid, I see that coming up in the chat, a favorite of pretty much everybody. And so the example that I picked out was from System Shock by Greg LaPiccolo. For those of you who haven't played System Shock, it has a very kind of general MIDI-ish soundtrack, but I think it still sounds pretty cool. Give it a sec. Oh no, YouTube. That's really them showing, just working within the limitations, knowing that they had MIDI devices. Every version of the soundtrack I've ever had has had this kind of like very, very MIDI-ish sound. And the only real difference is it uses a different MIDI format, but for all intents and purposes, it is the same thing as just a regular MIDI with a few extra controls. It's not going to change how it sounds, not really. What I found really interesting was I found a post on System Shock. This was logged originally way back in like 1998 and put out into the broader internet. So people have been interested in doing this kind of work and preserving it and sharing it with folks for a long, long time. Here's an interesting little fact for you. I think some of you may know that Final Fantasy VII on PlayStation 1 actually used MIDI because of space reasons, but the PC version did as well. I just recently discovered this when researching for the show. There were actually 4 different complete sets of MIDI files for the PC game for exactly this reason, because they didn't know what hardware you would have. So here's MIDIs if you have just like something, or the AWE line of chips or sound cards. So yeah, they and they have differences between them too. So they don't all sound quite the same, and there's different like effects and things applied. So this was a lot of work. And you know how huge Final Fantasy VII is. It's probably what, 80 tracks long. So it's like 400 songs completely. It's crazy. Moving on.
Which is funny because
Yeah.
that opens a whole can of worms,
Oh
right?
man, I don't
Because
want to get
like
into that.
even
Yeah.
before, like I
Yeah.
have an MT32 behind me over there, and like that's even before General MIDI. So like
Yeah,
it's
you
a
know what
it's a
I forgot to mention this, but the funny thing about MIDI is that it seems like it'd be straightforward, but everybody gets so attached to their own hardware. Like, oh, I listened to it on the Sound Blaster, or I listened to it on the SC88, and it's got to sound like that. So you have these people that go through the trouble of logging it on hardware so it sounds just like how they remember it. So you've got dozens of these for even a single game.
one thing that I want to bring up that is just incredible is we have a good friend of the show and somebody who's very prominent in the logging community, Valley Bell, who has all of this hardware like SC55 and SC88 Pro, MT32, and we'll play back a lot of these MIDI files on that hardware just to see what it would have been like on these different things. And so that's a whole other layer of like logging and trying to replicate something that these small kind of combinations of systems that people might have had.
Yeah. It's a every one of these is a giant can of worms. We got about 15 minutes left, so we gotta breeze through
We're
this.
good. We're good. We're
We're
good.
doing all right. We're doing all right. So, Brian, tell us about recordings and streaming audio. We got a great example for this one.
Right. You probably, I mean, this is the most straightforward and easiest to understand, but in some ways it's the least interesting. It's basically pre-baked audio files, right? So you can play these back on an audio player, maybe like Redbook Audio for something. For example, you tend to see a lot of this in the 90s, in the early days of CD-based games. So not sure if you had a Sega CD or maybe a Saturn or a PlayStation, and every once in a while you get lucky, if you were a nerd like us, and you could put it
Put it in your CD
in
player.
a CD player and see what comes out. Every now and then that would work. Redbook Audio. Um, it was, the files were relatively small to today's standards, but back then
Huge.
really ate up, ate up a whole CD and didn't give you much left for like a data. So Gene was talking about using MIDI data for Final Fantasy VII, or PlayStation's equivalent of MIDI for Final Fantasy VII. That's because the game needed so much data for the actual game itself that they couldn't, you know, load it up with all of these,
Yeah.
orchestral, waves, right?
Which is why later games ended up switching to like these other formats because, well, if half of the game disc is taken up by audio, that means I have to make the game smaller. No, music loses.
We
Sorry.
had we had we had a really good conversation with Iwadare-san, who did the music for the Lunar series, and he made a very, cautious example of saying like, hey, look, I prefer the music in the Sega CD version because it was exactly how I intended it. The problem was all of his music in Lunar had to be less than a minute long, I think, was the requirement, and then it also had to be able to loop correctly. And so that restriction he had made the files really small, fit in that space, but also he could only have like 12 songs. So everything else would have to translate to some other kind of audio format. And then Lunar for PlayStation, when it was redone, I think had to go back to the MIDI style.
Let's play our recorded audio sample. And this one is another great one. This is from Interstate 76. This is the track Vigilante Shuffle. YouTube doing its thing. Sorry. I know I don't want to cut those off either, but the funny thing about this track is it was just some band members that, especially like three or four of these, you probably know these
you've never
bands.
heard of.
Yeah, Third Eye Blind, Santana, Guns N' Roses, who cares? But essentially they were tasked with a project. They made together like a little mini supergroup, put on a fun like 70s funk inspired soundtrack to go with it's like a dream project, right? It's like, yeah, you don't have to like be your band, make whatever you want, just as long as it kind of like fits this weird vibe. So that's what they did. Is really cool.
Yeah, but even something as simple as recorded audio, there's still a lot of challenges, right? So recordings can take up a lot of space bandwidth. We mentioned this earlier. Sometimes they're actually compressed into other formats, and then you have to untangle, like Gene mentioned earlier on, in the talk about, kind of decrypting everything that they had to do to maybe make this file a lot smaller.
Yeah, we're on to our last example, and this is going to be a little bit on the short side just because it's kind of hard to talk about dynamic audio. It's really not our area of expertise, but you've probably played games nowadays that take full advantage of this. It's immersive based on what is going on in the game. The way that it plays out in the music is maybe you have something get added, the string section comes in or comes out, the mood changes, the tempo changes, all sorts of these different things that we can move dynamically through the game. And if you want to learn more about this, we had a really great interview with the composer Chase Bethia in our show 156. He did a live demo for us about how he used dynamic audio in a game. So it's in that recording. It's really great.
Cool.
I'm going to
some
show
examples.
Oh,
examples. You have the Nier example, right?
Yeah. I was going to just play a really, really quick example from Nier. So I try to keep this clip as short as possible, but the way it works is there's a town square. There's a lady playing sort of a string instrument. As you get closer, you hear her singing. When you start a conversation, the singing cuts out, and then as soon as the conversation ends, she starts singing again. And pretty much as long as you're within a certain radius, the music gets louder and quieter. It's really cool. So here it is. Just a little short conversation.
Aw, don't be sad. Look, why don't you go ask Popola? She's got a big brain, maybe she knows something.
That's a good idea. Thanks.
It's a beautiful song, and yeah, I even threw that nerd word in there, diegetic music. So games nowadays can do the same thing that films do when somebody turns on the CD player and you're hearing the same thing that they are. It's as if it's happening in the world. So uh, I threw this in there for those of us that remember Final Fantasy VI. The opera scene is kind of probably game's first experience with this in a big way. But ever since then, it's become super duper common, and it's awesome, and it makes games that much more immersive and expressive.
One of the examples we had, I
yeah.
think at our talk at the Library of Congress was the like Banjo Kazooie, for example. Your music's
Right.
playing bubbly, really bubbly music. You jump into the water, and all of a sudden, the music takes on a new shape. It's the same track, but it has more of a ethereal kind of feel to it, and Curse of Monkey Island. There's so many examples now. Red Dead Redemption that do this, and it really creates this much more immersive experience.
Yeah, exactly. We're getting close to the end, but I do want to breeze through a couple of things. Bryan, do you want to kind of just really quickly talk about some of this stuff?
Oh yeah, the different audio formats. This is
This is
again
deep in
like
the weeds,
five
but
other topics all in one. But some of the formats the logging community does. We talked about custom formats. Somebody has to write specifications for these, right? So the NES has its own NSF sound format, which was developed back in what 99,
99, yeah,
like
pretty
that
far
by
back.
Kevin Horton. Yeah, it's used for everything. People know it now. It's got 7 different kinds with the expansion audios, 50, 60 hertz, support for different regions of music, all over the place.
Oh yeah,
There's
everything under one umbrella.
Right. You got things like file formats that you need to have a way to play this stuff back. So authors have written things like VGM Play, right? Valley Bell wrote VGM Play, and there's Winamp plugins. Yes, people still use Winamp because it's a great way to play back music, and ZX Tune stuff like this. And a lot more to be able to kind of faithfully listen to this music back or this music data back through something that that can kind of translate it into something we can listen to easily.
Yeah, and
Um,
this
yeah,
one
go
is
ahead.
really interesting. This is super deep in the weeds, but the super crazy dedicated folks are, if they're unhappy with the way the sound goes, they will go and write better emulation code. So if you're familiar with a project like MAME, which is an arcade emulator, there's an entire dedicated community of people that write better audio. So, you're playing a game and it actually sounds correctly. It's a whole separate thing. And so some of those same folks are actually working on these kinds of things. So the playback isn't quite right in these formats. So we got to figure out, is it because of the format or is it because of the emulation? Oh, we're not actually capturing some aspect of the sound chip. We have to go back and rework some of this stuff. So yeah, it's
I
crazy deep.
I do want to call out CTR, who is a good friend of us,
Yes.
and is so fundamental to main project for audio reasons, and also developed some really great tools like Quattro Play, basically playing back just some amazing music that otherwise wasn't easy to play back, and has patched MAME and made the audio actually a lot better, even down to the finest, most like fine-grained details of a single track in a single game. He really puts a lot of effort to make this accessible to everybody, or available for others to listen to. It's incredible.
It is amazing. And
We need to get
honestly,
him on the show again
we
sometime
do,
for
we
sure.
do.
He's a really good guy.
So we started off this talk by saying the communities behind VGM. And we haven't really mentioned that many of them because this is another gigantic rabbit hole. So we're going to leave the screenshot up. We're going to talk a little bit about them, but we really don't have time. But the truth is, there's so many of these out there. Projects, some of them have been going on 20 something years. On the right, we have more of the European computers. On the left, we have more consoles and arcades, more of the Japanese side. VGM rips, which is a multi-chip source, so you can get music from arcade games, console games, SNES music, hopefully self-explanatory, SMS Power for Master System and Game Gear. I'm not going to run through the list entirely. It's mind-boggling to me just how many people hours have been put into all of this work over the years. It's crazy. It's just so humbling and amazing. And my introduction to VGM almost 20 years ago was finding, I think, the Commodore 64 archive and being like,
Yep.
a whole new world of music has opened to me. I didn't even know this existed. It was amazing. Yeah.
It's a really
I
good
don't know.
playback
Yeah.
too.
Yeah. But I also want to say that this is not some esoteric thing, some secret club. You can join too. Almost every one of these websites that you go to, especially the larger communities, they'll say, hey, do you want to contribute? Join the forum.
Yeah,
Email this person. Do this. Here are the instructions for how to participate. They really do want this to be a community effort. It's not like secret safeguarding.
Yeah, there's
Yeah.
nothing like, everybody really, the end goal is what we've been kind of preaching this whole time, really is to archive and enjoy outside of context some of this music that would otherwise be lost, right? So, we had VGM rips on there. That's a community that we're very close with. And a lot of those, folks have been, friends of mine for years. And, we do our best to contribute back the ways that we can. And the community, there's new people getting involved in creating packs and being able to do this work. And I know it seems like it's a slog to put together a lot of these packs, but it's also really rewarding when you put something together and know that you helped, uh, get this music out to so many other people. And that's it's it's such a cool feeling, and
It
people
is.
really appreciate it. I think people really do, especially in the community.
Yeah. We're running out on time pretty much, but I do want to just very, very, very quickly touch on this. I think we all sort of dance around this topic collectively as a community. The legal aspect of VGM is very, very complicated. So suffice it to say, the reason why we especially tend to focus on older music is because the games have been out so long, especially lesser known games. We're not here, as we said, to take money away from artists. Some game companies have started to figure out ways to monetize,
Monetize
bring
them,
back some
yeah.
of these, but that's a very, very small majority of this. An arcade game developer that went out of business 25 years ago, without these efforts, you're never going to hear that music again. And for some people that's not a big deal, but for us that just loves this stuff, it really is important for us to preserve it. And again, it's a bit of a legal gray area, but we try, especially for our show, we really do our best to make sure that we're not doing anything that's going to get in the way of any artist. If we play anything from a new game, it's always with the explicit permission of the composer, or we have them on, stuff like that.
We've had so many people on uh that have told us, like composers that have said, wow, you don't know how good that feels to say to share this music with other people. You guys, are talking about music that I wrote 40 something years ago, and it feels so crazy to me that people still care. And well, maybe they do, because now they're able to listen to it. We are starting to run out of time, but the importance here really is that it really is about the preservation, and it's not taking money out of anybody's hand, and nobody is trying to make money out of this. Really what it comes down to is exploration, and allowing others to explore something new. If you're really a huge fan of game audio, and more of the popular stuff, Mario, Zelda, Contra, whatever, like I really invite you to go listen to stuff that you maybe haven't heard, and I guarantee that you'll find that there's some stuff out there that just will have you in love in new ways.
Right. And I had a whole long slide here, but just to keep things very simple. I mean, really, this is about archiving game history. It's getting access to tons of great music that we wouldn't be able to hear otherwise. And I have this bullet point here about access having an equalizing effect. I don't think many of us would have ever heard of a Alberto Jose Gonzalez without it. And I'm actually going to play one last example before we wrap up the show, just sort of a quick thanks. This is from a game that I never would have figured out or heard of in any way without this community. This is from the game Star Trader. It's the title theme. It's called Launching. It was originally composed by Mieko Ishikawa from the Falcom sound team. Unfortunately, you're going to have to listen to the full show to hear the rest of that track or search for it yourself. It's an amazing track. Mieko Ishikawa is a wonderful composer. And, the thing is that I kind of want to just reinforce, her name was completely unknown because she just got encapsulated in this whole Falcom sound team. But now we know she wrote the music and we can seek out other stuff that she wrote. This kind of stuff just does not happen by accident. This is just the result of hours and hours of time-consuming work of really dedicated people, and we're just so proud to be a part of that community. So, yeah, don't forget to thank those people in the logging community and the many related communities like it. Emulation, translation. It's a whole big, messy kind of world, and hopefully, you have gotten just a little bit more appreciation for all of this in your own music production or music making or listening. It doesn't really matter. We love all this stuff.
Awesome. Anyways, thank you
Yeah.
so much for joining us today and listening to us talk about all of this logging community stuff. Hopefully it interests you. I'm sure it does because you're here at this event. So
Yeah.
thank you for joining. You can always email us. Go to our Twitter at Pixelated Audio. Find us online at pixelatedaudio.com. Join our Discord. There is a lot of people who are talking about logging in there and how to preserve audio, and sharing and really just being part of this community is awesome. Thanks everybody so much for taking the time out of your day to come join us.
Yeah. Thank you, VGM together.
So hopefully
I think
we're good.
Good.
We're still on the air. So, I mean,